Howdy, family. It's Jaquee Rogers with Talk2MAMA checking in here, and today will be the first of our week-long workshop series, specifically geared towards supporting Black students in schools and parents in supporting their children in schools around the acquiring of special education resources. And so today is just going to be a really brief overview, and we're not even specifically going to delve into how to acquire those services, but steps prior to and just some basic level knowledge, understanding about how the system works. So let's start with IDEA. Okay, so IDEA is legislation that is tied to the rights around special education. So if you anticipate the possibility of having to navigate the special education system on behalf of your child, it's important to know about the legislation that governs it. And so in the United States, that's called IDEA, and IDEA stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so to give you a brief overview of IDEA, in 1975, Congress first recognized the need to provide a federal law to help ensure that local schools would serve the educational needs of students with disabilities. And so the law they originally passed was titled the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. Things even say that. But that first special education law has undergone several updates over the past 30 years. In 1990, the law got a new name, thank God, and that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And so the most recent version of IDEA was passed by Congress in 2004, and it can be referred to as either IDEA 2004 or just IDEA. I feel like I've said IDEA a lot. And so this legislation gives states the federal funding to help make special education services available for students who've been identified with a disability. And it also provides very specific requirements to ensure a free, appropriate public education. That's actually the acronym FAPE, a free, appropriate public education for students with disabilities. And FAPE is the protected right of every eligible child in all 50 states and U.S. territories. So today, more than 6 million school-age children in the United States receive special education services. And almost half, about some 2.8 million, are students identified with a very specific learning disability. And a specific learning disability, or SLD, there are going to be a lot of acronyms throughout this workshop series. SLD is defined in IDEA as a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, which disorder may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. So in layman's terms, if your inability to speak or write manifests itself in your ability to accomplish the fundamental goals of education, which is to listen, think, write, read, spell, do math, then you are assured support in those areas. And so when we incorporate the big debate that exists around children of color, whether or not children of color are overrepresented, are identified, or underrepresented and identified in special education programs, we have people who stand on both sides of the fence. So we have some people who say Black students are simply shuffled into special education programming, while we have other people on the other side of the fence saying we have Black students who don't get enough of the resources they need in our schools. And in all transparency, both of those answers are correct, but I'll go into that for just a little bit. One of the largest debates at the intersection of special education programming and race is, like I said, that under or over representation or identification. And so a report released by the U.S. Department of Education in 2016 revealed that Black children ages 6 to 21 are already 40% more likely to be identified with disabilities than their peers. Nevertheless, it was explained by Kristen Harper and Edward Fergus, and I'll be sure to include the article that I'm pulling this information from in the special education information folder that I have available on the website. But they go on to say that while some communities may improperly deny special education services to children of color, it's also been traditionally overlooked by policymakers that an overrepresentation by race does exist. So let's talk about these words, overrepresentation and over-identification. Harper and Fergus defines overrepresentation as circumstances in which a racial or ethnic group has greater representation in special education than in the general school population. Over-identification involves any situation where a child is inappropriately identified with a disability and placed in special education. And so as it relates to IDEA, educators are actually compelled to appropriately identify each individual child with a disability, even if the result is disparity. So if we have tons of kids who are suffering from dyslexia, you know, instead of saying, oh, we got too many kids that we've identified with dyslexia, if that is the appropriate diagnosis for those children, even if it happens that a ton of those children are Black, at the end of the day, if they have dyslexia, they need the support necessary to overcome that and make the classroom work for them. However, it also mandates that school communities address the causes of racial and ethnic disparity within special education systems. So if that disparity does exist, and we notice that far more percentages of African American students or Latinx students or white students or Asian students or however you identify are being placed in a specific disability category, it's the responsibility of the school community to investigate why that is. So as research has pointed out time and time again, children of color represent an extremely disproportionate amount of the student population that is suspended and placed in segregational educated settings, especially when it comes to special education. However, what it's found is that that has not really improved their academic standing or strengths. And so when we think about the point of special education, it is to provide you with the necessary support you need to make education work for you, right? It's not a place to throw kids with behavioral challenges. And it's not even supposed to always be a permanent fix. The anticipation is that students who participate in special education or who receive special education services will be provided with the necessary tools they need to become as self-sufficient as possible. So if we provide a student who's experiencing dyslexia or is unable to do math, the belief or the hope around special education is that they'll receive the specialized attention and then have their needs met, so that they might even be able to function without it at some point. And so it's not supposed to be a permanent, consistently ongoing service for students who are able to grasp what they need from it and then move mainstream into the general education classroom 100% of the time. And so the interesting thing about what's happened with Black students is that their academic strengths and standings have not been improved significantly as a result of taking advantage of special education services. For example, the National Assessment of Educational Progress found that the percentage of Black children who are identified with disabilities at or above proficiency in reading. So students who were taking advantage of special education services who identified as Black, when it came to testing their reading, their level of proficiency rose from 1% to only 4% from 2002 to 2015. And so the students weren't performing better when it came to their language arts capabilities as a result of being in special education, not significantly for a 13-year span. So let me emphasize that statistic. In 13 years, the disparity gap was closed by only 3%. And so a large part of that has to do with what's called significant disproportionality. That's significant disproportionality. So remember earlier how I talked about overrepresentation when the ratio of students diagnosed with a particular disability is greater than that of the general student population. So on the national level, Black or African American students ages 6 through 21, and this is the data that's out there, were 2.08 and 2.22 times more likely to be served under IDEA Part B for 2 out of 13 very specific conditions identified by IDEA as conditions that receive special education services. And those conditions were emotional disturbance and intellectual disability, respectively. So 2.08 African American students who were being served under IDEA were found to have emotional disturbance, and 2.22 were identified or classified as having an intellectual disability. And so that's higher than all 6 to 21-year-olds in all the racial and ethnic groups combined. So Black students were over twice as likely than those demographics combined to be placed in classrooms that specifically, or with interventions that specifically dealt with emotional disturbance and intellectual disability. And if we're quite honest, I just remember, I'm just gonna interject with my own story here. I remember growing up, and I went to an elementary school, and I had things going on at home, granted, but I was bright. I was extremely bright. I tested extremely well, but the teacher struggled with me behaviorally. And so before even having me tested to find out academically where I stood, it was encouraged by the teacher. My mother was encouraged by the teacher to seek out special education services for me. And this is in no way to slight how meaningful special education services can be when used judiciously and appropriately. But what I had instead was a teacher who was just tired of my behavior. And I will echo Treasure Shields Redmond in my most recent blog post featuring her when she said, Black women stay saving us. And shout out to Black administrators, Black women administrators in particular, because that principal of my school at the time pulled my mom to the side because my mom was stressing. She was just like, now you're telling me my student might be a special needs student. This is all just, you know, we got all kinds of stuff going on at home. I need the support, but I don't know if this is the route to go. And that principal told my mom, you need to instead urge that you could be tested for gifted programming. And I actually think that's what my next round of videos is going to be on the talented and gifted programming in the United States. Because after that advice, my mom got me set up for that test, and I passed with flying colors. And that really charted the entire educational course for me throughout my schooling career. Because once I took that test and was identified as gifted, I got ushered into these predominantly white classrooms, but was exposed to so much opportunity. Like ridiculous amounts of opportunity, resources. We were building volcanoes in class. We were dissecting animals in class. Y'all, I'm talking like elementary school. Right. And so then when I go back and talk to all my Black friends who were in the general classroom, or some who'd even been identified as special needs, I was like, y'all, let me tell y'all where we went today. And they was like, we ain't getting none of that. We ain't get to do none of that. Right? And so even when we think about the stratification of education and where students are placed and why and when and how, that's an entirely different conversation that we will have. But I digress. And so, yeah, twice as likely nationally to be placed in classrooms that serve students with emotional disturbances or intellectual disabilities. However, that reality can vary from district to district. So in one state, for example, over a quarter of school districts identify Black students at rates at least 3 times higher than all other districts and ethnic groups combined. And so oftentimes scholars, especially those who are in charge of guiding education policy and legislation, use research that oftentimes blames individual traits of Black and brown students for the disparities in identifying the needs of the child. And so a lot of times that allows them to neglect the environmental. So environments that are created as a result of environmental racism, like where we live and the type of toxins and pollutions we're exposed to as a result. And that's automatically linked to poverty, right? Because it's a lot harder to get out of situations that are not conducive to your health when you ain't got the money, period. So instead of investigating those and the systemic inequities, the fact that these institutions ain't been good to us, and they are still thriving off of an extremely rocky foundation that has yet to admit the role of racism, sexism, heteronormativity in our institutions. We have yet to address that. And so we just continue to build policy on top of policy on top of policy on this shaky ground. And so instead of looking at those things, a lot of times there will be a lot of victim blaming going around. And it allows for fingers to be pointed at the child instead of asking what the school system needs to make school work for the kids. It's just like, well, if they did this better, then we wouldn't be in this predicament. But in reality, we need to be asking, how can we better support the schools so that they can support the students and meet them where they are? And so typically when a teacher gets tired of dealing with the kid or isn't supported with the know-how to identify resources to provide that specific student with their unique needs, they're thrown into special education. This hopeless picture is painted to the parents to the point where the parent feels like, oh crap, like, the school's gonna deal with them. I guess I have to kind of go along with the decision to, I'll just sign the paperwork, fine. And so that's, in essence, how our kids are typically shuffled into these special needs classrooms without there being a true assessment of what they need. And so I'll give a prime example, because I don't in any way want to slight the fact that tons of our kids enter these school systems with trauma. Trauma is real, but a lot of times that's manifested in behavioral ways. And other things that might result in a child getting upset is not having the language or the know-how to tell you that they're struggling with reading in your classroom, or they didn't have enough time on that test and they know they flunked it, or they need more time in this math class, as demonstrated by Treasure's experience with her own son, because he was able to pass once he was able to stay in the class longer and have longer to test. And so sometimes it's just modifications that need to happen in the approaches being taken to support our students, rather than them just being cast off according to the symptoms of what they're truly struggling with. And so I'm going to stick a pin in this conversation because this week tomorrow, as a matter of fact, I'll be going over these specific conditions that are covered under IDEA and designated as cause for seeking out special education services in the district. But before we go as far as to getting a formal education or evaluation done, there are some steps that can be taken and certain things to look for before having your child tested or formally evaluated for a special need. And so first and foremost, and I know it can be difficult for some of us because we be working, but it's important to communicate with your child's teacher about your concerns, especially if you recognize that your student is struggling. And so this step, in the event that you make it to the point of having to request special education services, it'll help strengthen your case if other interventions don't work. If we've tried and we know that nothing else is working for my child. And so in a nutshell, according to the IDEA Parent Guide, parents have every right to find out if the school has any additional services that might be available to help their child. And so there are some services available through provisions of IDEA and the No Child Left Behind Act, which was pioneered by George W. Bush. And so there are some key questions that we as parents can ask of schools regarding the quality of instruction and any additional support that your child is receiving. So first, let's identify a few terms. First term is intervention. So intervention is a change in instructing the student in the area of learning difficulty to try to improve learning and achieve adequate progress. Adequate progress is typically determined by tests that occur at the end of a unit or at the end of the semester to let the teacher and the system know whether or not the child is grasping the content. And so an intervention is when the teacher notices the child is not learning in the way that they're being taught. And so there are just slight adjustments or modifications made by the teacher or the instructor to help that child grasp the content better. Then we have pre-referral interventions. These are interventions that are delivered in the student's regular classroom that attempt to improve learning prior to a referral for formal special education evaluation. And so these are specific things that are done. Once interventions in the form of modifications and instruction are applied, pre-referral interventions are specific, like, okay, so this child is struggling in this, we are going to bring in some extra support into the classroom and have this support work specifically with this student. Okay, so we're gonna remember pre-referral intervention because we're gonna route back around to that towards the end of our time together, staff. And then we already identified what specific learning disability is, and I'll just reiterate, it's disorder, and one or more of the basic psychological processes that's involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, and because of that, because the child is struggling with language, either spoken or written, it makes it difficult for them to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. And so if your child is having trouble learning, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a disability, like a specific learning disability. While a learning disability could be a possible source, there may also be others. And I'll give you 4, as it's listed in the IDEA Parents Guide. So the school's approach to teaching basic academic skills like reading may not be achieving adequate results for all students. So very well could be the style of teaching that's being offered in the classroom. There's a chance that your child entered this grade unprepared. So the previous learning may not have prepared them sufficiently for the lessons the teacher's presenting. There could be cultural or language differences, and I'll always say that if we're not understanding one another, whether that's as a result of us not speaking the same learned language or because you speak in this academic jargon and I don't know what the hell that means, right? So a language barrier exists, and it might make it difficult to communicate with the teacher, and it might also prevent access to learning materials. And then it might be some other condition, like poor hearing or vision, that make it difficult for the child to see the board or hear what the teacher is saying. And so those might be some other things to consider that might not specifically be tied to a learning disability. And so there are also a few ways that the school could provide assistance to your child before a formal evaluation for special education is considered. So a way for them to assess or maybe be able to determine as they're moving through their educational career whether or not special education is something to be considered. So we have early intervening services. And so these services were designed to encourage school districts to provide additional support for struggling students within the general education program. And so it allows schools districts the option of using up to 15% of their federal special education funding to develop and implement coordinated early intervening services for children in kindergarten through 12th grade who are not currently identified as needing special education or related services, but who need additional academic and behavioral support to succeed in general education. And so this money can be used in a variety of ways. It can be used for professional development to help train teachers, as well as for providing direct services for the child. And so some of those services might include educational and behavioral evaluations. And let me stick a pin in that. Your child should not be tested for anything that you do not know about. If your child is being evaluated for something, permission has to go through you first. Okay? I digress. So the services can include educational and behavioral evaluations, services and support such as beginning and or remedial reading instruction, interventions to address behavior, small group instruction, and instruction in the use of adaptive and instructional software. So maybe some computer programming that helps to strengthen the access the student has to the information or that targets specific academic skills. IDEA 2004 requires that the academic and instructional interventions that are used are backed up by scientifically based evidence of their effectiveness. So we can't, just have some made up intervention that ain't been tested and proven to help anybody being used on our kids. Now, that is a catch-22 because sometimes what people know will work based on relatability or cultural understanding of the students hasn't had their stuff scientifically proven or deemed evidence-based. Just because the whole damn system is racist as hell. to put it bluntly. And a lot of times what we know will work hasn't really made its way into respected spheres of academia that are willing to listen to how we can truly support Black and brown kids in schools. So that is something to take with a grain of salt. And so, however, when these supports are provided effectively and they're successful, the school and the student can benefit. So the school can save money on costly evaluations required to determine eligibility for special education, as well as all the additional costs associated with providing those special education supports. And typically these pre-referral interventions are provided in the student's regular classroom. So they receive support aimed at helping them work at the grade level. The goal is to help as many students as possible reach their potential in school without needing to be placed in special education programming. And so it's important to ask what type of pre-referral intervention is happening. It's also important to know that because this is not, is just because the early intervening services are not technically a special education service, some of the safeguards, which we'll go into when we talk a little bit later down the line around IEPs and 504 plans, some of the safeguards that are in place to protect parents through the actual special education process might not necessarily apply here. Okay. And so that's just something to remember as we go through those safeguards. If you want to think about or route back around to the conversation about early intervening services, know that those do not fall under the procedural safeguards that are in place for parents going through the 504 IEP process. Okay, so next there's the Reading First program. And this program is typically geared, don't let me misspeak, typically geared towards elementary school programs who've been identified as having failing reading rates. So elementary schools that have been identified as having high rates of reading failure. And so it provides funds for teacher training, reading screening and assessments, instructional materials and strategies proven to prevent or remediate reading failure. And so while learning to read can be complex and multidimensional in its process, there are some essential components of reading instruction that have been identified in No Child Left Behind. And these have also been incorporated into IDEA 2004. And so it's important before you go in saying like, my child can't read, they got a learning disability, check the school for whether or not they are meeting these essential components of reading instruction. And so I'm just gonna go over a brief checklist of what you should be listening for in your own child. And if you end up going in and possibly observing a classroom or reading class in particular, the types of things that you should be looking for. And so there are 5 essential components of reading instruction that research has identified. That's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. So phonemic awareness is knowing that words are made of individual sounds and being aware of and able to manipulate these sounds. And these sounds are called phonemes. So phonemes are the smallest part of sound in a spoken word. So the S in sit and it, right? So those are the phonemes. So your child should be able to perceive individual sounds, think about them, and manipulate them. So they should be able to rhyme. They should be able to say, the fat cat pat, right? So they should be able to recognize that those words sound the same. Picking out syllables in spoken words. Separating the sounds in words. So, for example, we'll go back to sit. They should go, right? They should be able to break up the separate sounds in a word. So that's phonemic awareness. So phonics is the relationship between sounds and letters. So they should understand that letters are representations of sounds before they can learn to read. And so it helps children with letter sound correspondence, understanding how and why the alphabet works. And so that should start around kindergarten or first grade and last for a couple of years. Okay, so by the middle of elementary school, they should have some grasp on phonics. So fluency, and that's the ability to read a text accurately and quickly. And because fluent readers don't have to concentrate on recognizing the words, they can focus their attention on what the text means. So because I can read without sitting here trying to work my way through what each word says, I can do that pretty flawlessly. Now I can just focus on interpreting it. And so that's what bridges the gap between simply recognizing words and being able to comprehend what you're seeing. And so vocabulary is knowing words and knowing what words mean. There are 4 different types. So there's listening vocabulary, there's speaking vocabulary, there's reading vocabulary, and there's writing vocabulary. So for each child, each of those vocabularies might include something different. But they could also have overlapping sets of words. And so beginning readers are able to use their oral vocabularies as they recognize the sounds in the words they're reading. It's much easier for them to read words that are a part of their oral vocabularies. If they're talking it and if they're saying it, it's typically easier for them to read it. So reading comprehension is the last one, and it's being able to understand, remember, and communicate what's been read. So after we read something, I should be able to regurgitate it, I should be able to summarize it. But this reading to learn does not come automatically. Once students have learned to read, strategies for taking that meaning from text need to be taught. And so at all grade levels, students can benefit from instruction on how to make sense out of text and how to construct meaning. So that's not something they should have mastered by the time they're out of elementary school, but it is something that you should see continually grow in them as they get older. This ability to not only read, but to be able to derive meaning from what they're actually reading. And so through all of this, and those are 2 of the 3 interventions I'm going to talk about today, and then I'll move into RTI once I make this little comment here. But through all of it, it's important to establish and maintain some strong homeschool communications to get the best help for your child. And so there are some critical things you can do to make sure that that happens. First of all, it's important to keep communication open with your child's teacher. Listen carefully if they're describing problems with aspects of your child's learning. And if you think the problems are serious enough to require special attention, ask the teacher if alternate, I'm sorry, I can't get that word out. Ask your teacher if alternate instructional approaches might help address the problem, and ask if they've been tried. Right? So, for example, if students are sitting there and all they're doing is writing out math problems, they're never talking about them, they're never discussing them, they're never getting up to do them on the board, they're never working in groups, there is no variation or differentiation in how the students are being taught. It's important to ask your teacher whether or not that's something they're considering before they're coming to you and telling you that your child is failing, or before you get a report card and see that your child is struggling in a class. To the best of your ability, try to keep track of the instructional practices that are being used to help address your child's problems, and record, if and when you're able, how well they're assisting your child's learning. So let's say you go in and you have that conversation with the math teacher and they decide to incorporate more group learning, right? On your next follow-up with that teacher, asking, hey, I know Marcus was struggling last time we talked, and he came home and said that he was working in groups, and I'm just wanting to follow up with you to see if maybe that's a better instructional way for Marcus to learn in your class. Because knowing how your child learns will help you collaborate more effectively with teachers about what they can be doing to help support your child in school. Ask about the effectiveness of the instructional practices or behavioral programs that are being used. Ask for research, right? You can come to me with the research. I'll help you decipher it if that's something that you struggle with. But make sure that your school is using tried and true methods and teaching your kids that have worked. Okay, because they could be in there just throwing something together. And this tends to not be the case because school districts have to cover their behinds. And so they should have available to you the research behind the methods that they're using to support your child in class. Discuss whether there are cultural factors that might make a difference. And so if you're noticing that some of the customs or practices in the class don't really align with what your child is used to, explain that background to the teachers and other educators so that they can understand your child's behavior and their actions. And this information that can be provided by family members and parents alike can be crucial to understanding where some of the difficulties might lie. Okay. Try your best to understand the way that your child learns and be able to communicate what you think will help the teacher better understand your child's specific learning style. If your kid struggles with sitting down for long periods of time, if they are very social beings, if they're not social at all, if they're avid readers and writers, if they like music around them all the time, the smallest detail could really be beneficial in helping your child's teacher create an atmosphere that's conducive to your child being successful in learning. And finally, find out if supplementary educational services, such as tutoring, are available at your child's school, and investigate the programs to see if they benefit your child. There needs to be some type of supplemental support that exists in the school if your child needs additional resources in being successful, period. All righty. So the last thing that I'm going to share with you all today is about response to intervention. And RTI is strongly encouraged by IDEA 2004. And so if you're a parent who recognizes that your child is struggling in school, but you're unsure about whether or not you want them tested, or you're not sure about whether or not they have a learning disability, it will behoove you to know about RTI or whatever intervention programming or process your school has in place. I know that in Missouri, it's mainly RTI and it's some discrepancy model, but that's slowly but surely phasing out because it does not address the overarching number of conditions that are identified under IDEA, which promotes RTI. So that discrepancy model is slowly being phased out. And it's also been argued that with that model, it takes too long to identify whether or not a student needs help. And the sooner an intervention or services are rendered to a child, the more likely they'll be to have that solid foundation and be able to navigate the education system a lot better. So RTI is what I'll be tackling today. And so if you'd like any more information on the discrepancy model, I'd be happy to send it. If enough people request it, I wouldn't mind making a video about that too. But anyway, RTI. So RTI stands for response or responsiveness to intervention. IDEA encourages schools to begin using a process that determines if students respond to a scientific research-based intervention as part of the evaluation procedures to determine which students may have a specific learning disability and need special education. And so earlier we talked about these pre-referral interventions, and I want to discuss to you how RTI is different. RTI is a lot more strategic And so many schools, districts, and even some states have established procedures for pre-referral interventions. And these are designed to provide, like I said before, additional support to struggling students prior to referral for special education evaluation. However, little research has been done on the effectiveness of this approach. And it can vary from school to school, depending on where you are and the common practices in that school. Pre-referral interventions can look different depending on where you go. And oftentimes pre-referral interventions have frequently been used without close monitoring or documentation of the student's progress. And so the critical thing about that is that monitoring and record keeping provide the critical information that's needed to make decisions about the student's future instruction. And so we can have students going through the whole entire school year on pre-referral interventions, and nothing will have actually been documented to say this is how this student thrives or this is how this student doesn't thrive. So at the very least, they're not moving on to the next grade with documentation in place to support the next teacher in providing a conducive classroom to your child's success. And so if monitoring and record keeping doesn't occur along with the pre-referral strategies, ultimately the opportunity to make informed decisions about the student's future instruction and intervention needs is lost. And equally as important, is the adequacy of instruction that's being delivered in the general education student or class where the student might be experiencing learning difficulties. And so with pre-referral interventions, not only is student progress not being monitored, teaching instruction is not being monitored either, right? And so it's really difficult to assess whether or not the teachers approach to educating their child is what's not working. And so it happens quite frequently that the instructional program being used in general education, such as the beginning reading program, is not scientifically based and does not have a high success rate for most students. It's very possible that what's being implemented through those pre-referral interventions are not working. Contrarily, however, successful implementation of RTI, it requires a number of essential components that ensure high quality instruction, like careful monitoring and documenting of progress, and close collaboration between general education and special education classrooms. And it really is intentional around taking a student who's been identified as struggling and prescribing interventions that are closely monitored, both from their progress and from the instructional approach of the educator to determine more specifically what is and is not working for that child. Okay? So the first question is to ask what pre-intervention strategies are being employed in the classroom? Is there any type of modification in instruction to adapt to my child's learning style? Are there additional supports that are available in the school that might give my child more time with this subject? See if maybe that's what the struggle is. And so asking that question, and then asking what interventions and supports exist in this school that we can monitor and track, so that we can know whether or not special needs or special education instruction is necessary. And so really quickly, I'm going to talk about RTI and its three-tiered model really quickly. And so I want you to picture a triangle, right? It's really narrow at the top, and the further down you get, it gets wider and wider. And so the very top, and imagine that this triangle is broken down into three different sections, and the top is the most narrow. The middle is second narrowest, and the bottom is the widest. And so at the bottom is tier 1. And so that's screening and group intervention. So pretty much students who are placed at risk are identified using like universal screening or results from state or district-wide testing, and through training and group interventions, weekly progress monitoring of all students for a brief period is done. And identified students receive supplemental instruction or interventions that are generally delivered in small groups during the student's regular school day, in the regular classroom. And so the length of time for this step can vary, but it generally should not exceed 8 weeks, right? So you get standardized test scores back, you identify students who are struggling in math, you pull them together, sometimes during a class period where, other students might be working on other projects or something else, but you're able to pull students to the side and give them a specific dosage of whatever content or support that they need. And during that time, the progress of the students is very closely monitored. They'll use some type of screening process like a curriculum-based measurement, which pretty much takes the main concepts they should have known, asks them questions about it to see if they've grasped the content. And students who show significant progress are generally returned to the regular classroom. And students who don't show adequate progress during that time frame are bumped to tier 2. Which are more targeted interventions. And so students who are not making adequate progress in the regular classroom in tier 1 are usually provided with more intensive services and interventions. And so these resources are provided in addition to instruction in the general curriculum. And they're typically provided in small group settings. And so typically in the earlier grades, like from K through 3, interventions are usually in the areas of English or reading and math. And so a longer period of time may be required for this tier, but it generally should not exceed a grading period. All right, and so grades, so typically no longer than a semester. Okay. So students who continue to show too little progress at this level of intervention, so it should never be a child is struggling and all of a sudden they end up with special education services. We need to ask, are these interventions happening? And so students really aren't thriving at tier 2. Interventions are bumped up to the tier 3 level. And so depending on the school's particular model of RTI, parents may or may not be involved in tier 2. Ideally, and this might have to happen more on your part, parents, than it will on the schools. Schools should involve parents at the earliest stages of RTI by explaining the process in face-to-face meetings, by providing written intervention plans, and by requesting parental consent, especially if there's any type of evaluation that's going to go forward. And so that's why staying in the loop about your child's grades, the interventions that are happening on the school level to get your child to where they need to be, and whether or not any action plans have been written out. And if you feel it's necessary that they are, request them. Let them know you'd like to start the process of getting some written intervention plans together, so that you can start monitoring and assessing what does and does not work for your child in the classroom. Okay. So the third tier, which is our little baby triangle here, is where students receive individualized, intensive interventions that target the student's skill deficits. And so students who do not respond to these targeted interventions are then considered for eligibility as required by IDEA. And so at any point during this 3-tiered RTI process, IDEA allows parents to request a formal evaluation to determine eligibility for special education. However, the RTI process cannot be used to deny or delay a formal evaluation for special education. So they can't come back and tell you, oh, you ain't worked through all 3 of the tiers yet. I'm sorry, you're gonna have to wait until we get to number 3. At any point, if you recognize as that child's parent that it's just not working, you can request a formal or evaluation for special education services. Let's see here. So about these written intervention plans that I mentioned, about those. So if your child's school is using an RTI process to address your child's difficulties, you should expect to receive a written intervention plan. And so this plan should include details about how the school is planning on helping your child. And so it should be fully explained to you. And it should include the following: a description of the specific intervention. So Marcus is struggling with determining the numerator from the denominator, right? So fractions. The length of time, such as the number of weeks that will be allowed for the intervention to have a positive effect. And a lot of times that's also linked to that scientific research-based intervention and requesting to know, like, what's the specific intervention you're using for my child? And how long do they say it's supposed to take before it actually works? So the number of minutes per day the intervention will be implemented. So how much time will my child spend in the general education classroom, and how much time will my child have outside of the classroom working on this intervention? The person is responsible for providing the intervention, right? So who will be in charge of instructing my child or guiding my child through this intervention? Where will the intervention be provided? The factors for judging whether the student is experiencing success. So how will we monitor? How will we know it's working, right? What are the specific measures in place to assure that what you're telling me will support my child? How do we make sure that that's happening? And also a description of the progress monitoring strategy or approach that will be used. So will there be curriculum-based measurement? Will there be tests after every chapter? You know, how will we test to know that my child is progressing? And then finally, a progress monitoring schedule. So how often will my child be evaluated around whether or not this intervention is working? Let's see. What is not appropriate instructional interventions? Now, what should not be a part of an RTI intervention plan? And this is where we talk to our kids to find out whether or not what we're being promised actually works. So special or reassigned seating in the classroom is not an RTI intervention. Shortened assignments is not an RTI intervention. A lot of times what we'll find is that to make the load easier on them and to not get any backlash from the students, we'll just dumb the assignment down. Right, and in the moment, that's convenient. You know, the kid's like, shoot, I got to do less work? Okay. And the teacher's like, okay, I don't have to deal with that anymore. Right, but in the meantime, we're not really skill building or problem solving with that student. We're just taking the load off completely. And so shortening the assignments. Now, maybe modifying the assignments. Maybe there needs to be modification around how the instructions are given or how the problem is worded, right? But the aims and the goals of the assignment should not change. Communications with the parent about the child at regular parent-teacher conferences or other informal communications. So saying that a part of the RTI intervention is when a parent shows up to parent-teacher conference and we're just talking about how LaJohnny doing in class. Like, that is not a part of the RTI intervention process or plan. Classroom observations are not. So if a principal is coming in and observing the class, that doesn't get noted as an instructional intervention. Suspensions, holding kids back. and then just staying consistent with the same type of instruction or assignments that have been given. None of those are classified as viable RTI intervention strategies. And so I think that's where we're going to stop for today. Just to give us a brief overview of what we discussed. We talked about IDEA, the individuals with disability, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We briefly discussed some of the racial disparities that exist around the over-identification and over-representation of Black students in special education. We also reviewed steps to take before pushing for your child to be formally evaluated for special education. We discussed interventions, pre-referral interventions. We defined specific learning disabilities. We also talked about early intervening strategies and supports, as well as the Reading First program. We discussed RTI, which is response or responsiveness to interventions. So ways we can push schools to provide strategic and necessary support around specific areas in which our children are struggling. And there's one last thing I would like to add on to the RTI conversation, and this was also in the IDEA Parent Guide, which I'll have included in the special education folder, Google Doc folder. So 10 questions to ask about RTI. Number 1, is the school district, and this is something you can proactively ask before you've even encountered struggles, is the school district currently using an RTI process to provide additional support to struggling students? If not, they plan to. What screening procedures are used to identify students in need of intervention? Number 3, what are the interventions being used and what research supports their effectiveness? Number 4, what process is used to determine the intervention that will be provided? 5, what length of time is allowed for an intervention before determining if the student is making adequate progress? 6, what strategy is being used to monitor student progress? 7, is a written intervention plan provided to parents as part of the RTI process? 8, is the teacher or other person responsible for providing the interventions trained in using them? Right, so will we have somebody else coming in to work with our kids? Or is it the teacher's responsibility to facilitate this intervention? Number 9, when and how will information about a student's performance and progress be provided? So how will I get updates on my child? And number 10, at what point in the RTI process are students who are suspected of having learning disabilities referred for formal evaluation? So how long does this have to go on before we take the next step, if it's necessary, before we take the next step towards securing special education services for my child? So if there's any topic within the umbrella of topics that I discussed today, or if there's anything that you need further clarity on, or if there's something else that you would like for me to include in this special education conversation this week, please do not hesitate to let me know. Feel free to respond on any of the pages that I'm posting this on. You can Facebook me through my personal page, Quee Rogers, or through the Talk2MAMA LLC page. You can also email me, mama2mama314@gmail.com. And I will also be posting the YouTube link to this video on my website, along with some additional resources as we process throughout the week. So Mama2MAMA.net is that website. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope to see you tomorrow.